If your parents or grandparents were around during World War II, they might have even lived through the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they even knew someone sent to a concentration camp.
Yeah.
In this deep dive, we're going to unpack how Auschwitz went from just a concentration camp to the horrific death factory it became.
Right.
We're going to be using the insights from historian Nicholas Waxman and his book KL, A History of the Nazi Concentration Camps.
What's really striking is that this whole Nazi concentration camp system, as awful as it became, it didn't actually start with like some big master plan.
Really?
It kind of evolved over time.
Wow.
Yeah, it was fueled by a whole bunch of different factors.
So you're saying this monstrous system, it just kind of arose organically?
Absolutely.
That's almost more terrifying than if it was planned out, from the get-go.
Yeah, and Waxman really emphasizes this.
Okay.
He talks about how those early days of the Nazi regime, they were marked by improvisation, a real lack of any clear blueprint for the camps.
So let's back up a bit then to those early days right after Hitler takes power in 1933.
Okay.
What were these camps actually like? What was their initial purpose?
Well, you got to understand the political climate in Germany back then in 1933, it was a powder keg.
Right.
The Nazis were solidifying their power. They needed to silence any opposition.
Yeah.
They needed a place to put all the people they considered, quote unquote, enemies of the state.
So these camps, they're primarily meant to just quell political dissent.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh.
They became a tool to just suppress anyone seen as a threat to the Nazi party.
I see.
And these early camps, they weren't the massive complexes that we think of today.
Not like Auschwitz.
No, not at all.
Okay.
They were often set up in whatever existing structures they could find.
Oh, wow.
Abandoned factories, old hotels, even former military barracks. Like one of the first camps, Dachau, it was a former munitions factory.
Just hearing that name Dachau, it sends chills down my spine.
I know, it's a sobering reminder of those early days for sure.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember, the first prisoners sent to these camps, they were mainly political opponents.
Right.
Communists, socialists, trade unionists, anyone who opposed the Nazi ideology.
So the focus was on silencing dissent, not yet on racial or ethnic extermination.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This shift to targeting specific groups like the Jewish people that came later.
Gotcha.
In those early years, the main goal was to crush any political opposition through terror and intimidation.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of prisoners were actually released
Really?
after enduring brutal treatment.
Wow.
It was meant to serve as a warning to anyone else who might consider resisting.
It's a terrifying form of social engineering.
It is.
Just break the spirit of your opponents, instill fear in everyone else. That's how they solidify their control.
Precisely.
Yeah.
This kind of strategy, using forced labor camps and political prisons to maintain power, it's been used throughout history by regimes trying to eliminate dissent.
Yeah, it's a sobering thought for sure.
It is.
But for now, let's stay focused on the Nazi system.
Okay.
How did these early kind of chaotic camps evolve into the industrialized killing machine that Auschwitz would eventually become?
Well, there were two major events that dramatically changed the course of the Nazi camp system.
Okay.
The invasion of Poland in 1939 and Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941.
Right. The invasion of Poland was a huge turning point.
Absolutely.
Suddenly, the Nazis controlled this vast new territory with a very large Jewish population.
Exactly. And this is when Auschwitz emerges as a key location within the camp system.
Why Auschwitz specifically? What made it so important to the Nazis?
A couple of reasons.
Okay.
It was strategically located with good transport links,
Right.
which were crucial for moving prisoners and supplies.
Makes sense.
And it also had existing infrastructure, a former Polish military base
Oh,
that could easily be converted into a camp.
So initially, the camp was actually intended for Polish political prisoners, not Jewish people.
That's right. The first mass transport of prisoners to Auschwitz in June 1940. It consisted mainly of Polish political prisoners.
Okay.
The conditions were horrendous.
Yeah.
But at this point, Auschwitz was still primarily a concentration camp, not an extermination camp.
But things were about to take a very dark turn, weren't they?
They were.
Yeah.
The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941,
Right.
that marked a horrific escalation of Nazi brutality and a significant radicalization of their racial ideology.
Yeah, the scale of human suffering that was unleashed during Operation Barbarossa, it's just unimaginable.
It's truly horrifying.
Yeah.
The Nazis viewed the Slavic people of the Soviet Union as racially inferior, and they implemented this horrifying policy of mass murder and enslavement in those occupied territories.
Right.
And this ideological shift toward genocide, this had a profound and devastating impact on Auschwitz.
So we're getting closer to that point where Auschwitz transitions into a full-fledged death camp. What was the final catalyst for that transformation?
The Wannsee Conference in January 1942.
Right.
This is where high-ranking Nazi officials met to coordinate the quote-unquote final solution, the systematic genocide of European Jews.
It was a truly chilling moment in history.
It was.
So before Wannsee, the killing of Jews was already happening.
Yes.
But it was more decentralized, right?
Yeah.
Less organized?
It was often carried out by mobile killing squads called the Einsatzgruppen.
Right.
These units followed the advancing German army, massacring Jewish communities in just horrific acts of violence.
So Wannsee signals this chilling shift towards industrialized killing.
It does.
A bureaucratic system designed to make mass murder more efficient.
Right.
And perhaps even more discrepanly, less psychologically taxing on the perpetrators.
You're absolutely right.
Wow.
And Auschwitz would become a key site in this terrifying new system. One of the methods they implemented was the use of poison gas. It's horrifying to think about how this technique was first developed in the T4 euthanasia program, where they systematically murdered people with disabilities.
It's mind-boggling how they took a method designed for one group of victims and applied it on such a massive scale to another.
It's all stemmed from the Nazis' warped ideology that saw these victims as expendable, as less than human.
Yeah.
You know, it's crucial to remember that this genocide wasn't just about hatred. It was about systematic dehumanization.
Right.
They stripped these individuals of their dignity, their very right to life.
So by 1942, the stage was set for Auschwitz to transform into a true death factory.
It was.
Can you paint a picture for our listeners what it was actually like to arrive there? What would someone experience?
Okay, imagine this. You've been crammed into a cattle car for days with no food, water, or sanitation.
Oh, gosh.
You're terrified, disoriented, and completely in the dark about where you're even going.
Yeah.
Then the train screeches to a halt and you're herded out onto a platform.
Blinded by these harsh spotlights.
Oh, wow.
This is Auschwitz-Birkenau.
And then the selection process.
Yes.
It's hard to even fathom the terror of that moment.
It is.
Families being torn apart. Their fate decided in an instant.
Exactly. Families ripped apart their fate, determined in just a split second by SS officers, pointing left or right.
Wow.
Those deemed unfit for work, they were sent directly to the gas chambers.
Oh, girl.
While others were selected for slave labor.
So even if you weren't sent to the gas chambers immediately, it was often just a temporary reprieve.
It was.
A slow death sentence through starvation, disease, and overwork.
Absolutely.
And for those selected for immediate extermination, the process was designed to be as efficient and dehumanizing as possible.
It was.
Can you describe what that horrific process actually entailed?
The victims were led into these rooms disguised as showers, told to undress, hang their clothes on hooks.
Gosh.
Then Zyklon B pellets were dropped through vents in the ceiling,
releasing this toxic gas.
Wow.
It was a slow and agonizing death.
It's almost unbearable to even think about.
I know.
What happened to the bodies afterwards.
That's where the Sonderkommando came in.
Sonderkommando.
Yeah.
Their story is one of the most tragic and ethically complex aspects of the entire Holocaust.
It is.
Yeah.
These were Jewish prisoners forced to assist with the disposal of the bodies.
Oh, wow.
They had to remove the corpses from the gas chambers.
Oh, my God.
Extract gold teeth.
Wow.
Shave hair.
Jeez.
And then transport the bodies to the crematoria.
It was a horrific job, a form of psychological torture that most couldn't endure for very long.
Many committed suicide.
Right.
While others clung to this desperate hope that by cooperating, they might somehow survive.
One of the most powerful testaments to the horrors endured by the Sonderkommando comes from Zalman Gradowski.
Yes.
A Polish Jew forced to work in that unit. His hidden writings offer this just harrowing firsthand account of the atrocities that he witnessed and the moral torment he endured.
His words, they cut through the historical distance and remind us of the human cost of this genocide.
It's important to remember that while Gradowski himself didn't survive, his words did.
They did. His writings are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, even in the face of unimaginable evil.
They're also a reminder that even in the darkest depths of human cruelty, there were acts of resistance, attempts to preserve memory, and a refusal to let the perpetrators erase the evidence of their crimes.
Absolutely.
These stories are incredibly difficult to hear.
They are.
But they're so important.
I agree.
They force us to confront the darkest aspects of human nature and grapple with the complexities of this history.
It's not just about remembering the past.
Right.
It's about learning from it.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing the warning signs of prejudice and intolerance,
Right.
and understanding how seemingly ordinary people can become complicit in these extraordinary acts of evil.
And that brings us to a truly unsettling question. Okay. As the atrocities at Auschwitz were unfolding, what did the outside world know, and why wasn't more done to stop it?
That's a question that has haunted historians and survivors for decades.
Yeah.
And it's important to note that information about the camps, it did filter out.
Okay.
Through Polish underground reports, escaped prisoners,
Right.
even decrypted SS communications.
So the Allies weren't completely in the dark?
No.
They had some sense of the scale of the horror unfolding.
They did, but the full extent of the genocide wasn't clear until much later.
Okay.
And there were these very complex debates about the best course of action.
I see.
Like Churchill's decision not to bomb the camp, for example.
Yeah.
That's still hotly debated today.
Yeah. Some argued that bombing the camp would risk killing prisoners,
Right.
while others believed it was the only way to disrupt the killing process.
Exactly.
There are really no easy answers when you're dealing with such a horrifying situation.
You're right. It's a moral dilemma with no satisfying solution.
Yeah.
But as the war progressed and the Red Army closed in on Auschwitz,
Right.
the Nazis attempted to cover up their crimes and evacuate the camp.
And this led to the horrific death marches.
It did.
Where thousands of prisoners were forced to walk for miles in the freezing winter,
Yes.
many dying from exhaustion exposure or being shot by the SS.
It's a tragic irony that for many prisoners, liberation didn't mean the end of their suffering.
Right.
They had endured the horrors of Auschwitz only to perish on the death marches or in other camps.
It's a stark reminder that the trauma of Auschwitz extended far beyond its liberation.
It did.
Leaving lasting scars on the survivors and on our collective understanding of human cruelty.
Absolutely.
But we'll delve deeper into that in the next part of our deep dive.
As we continue our deep dive into the horrors of Auschwitz, it's really important to remember that behind the staggering statistics, there were individual human beings with their own stories, hopes, and dreams.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in the numbers, to feel overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the tragedy. But each life lost at Auschwitz represents an entire world extinguished, a family shattered, a future stolen.
Exactly. And that's why in this part of our deep dive, we're going to shift our focus to the individual experiences of those who were imprisoned in Auschwitz.
Okay.
We've talked about the harrowing account of Zalman Gradowski, the Sonderkommando member, whose writings offer us a glimpse into the darkest depths of the camp.
Right.
But there are countless others whose stories deserve to be heard as well.
Absolutely. Their stories help us understand the human cost of this genocide in a way that statistics simply can't.
One such story is that of Primo Levi,
Okay.
an Italian Jewish chemist who was deported to Auschwitz in 1944. His memoir, If This Is a Man, it's considered one of the most powerful and insightful accounts of life in a concentration camp.
Yeah, I've read Levi's work.
Okay.
And it's incredibly stark and unflinching in its depiction of the daily struggle for survival, the constant humiliation, the complete erosion of human dignity.
What's particularly striking about Levi's account is his focus on the psychological effects of the camp experience. He describes how the Nazis systematically stripped prisoners of their identity,
Right.
reducing them to mere numbers, forcing them to compete for scraps of food,
Wow.
pitting them against each other in this just brutal struggle for survival.
It's a chilling example of how the Nazis used psychological manipulation as a weapon, breaking down the spirit of their victims, making them more compliant, less likely to resist.
Right.
It's almost more insidious than the physical violence.
You're absolutely right. It was a calculated form of psychological warfare.
Wow.
And Levi doesn't shy away from examining the moral compromises that prisoners were forced to make to survive.
Right.
He grapples with the guilt of those who collaborated with their captors, even if it was just to get a slightly larger ration of bread or to avoid a beating.
It forces us to ask ourselves some very difficult questions,
It does.
How would we behave in such extreme circumstances? Would we be able to hold on to our moral compass?
Exactly.
Or would we succumb to the pressures of survival, even if it meant betraying our fellow prisoners?
It's a question with no easy answers.
Right.
Levi himself acknowledges that judging the actions of those who live through such horrific experiences, it's a complex and challenging endeavor.
Another powerful memoir that sheds light on the female experience in Auschwitz is I Have Lived 1,000 Years by Livia Bitten-Jackson.
Oh, yes.
She was just 13 years old when she arrived at Auschwitz with her mother and brother.
Her story is an incredible testament to the resilience and resourcefulness of children, even in the face of such unimaginable cruelty.
Yeah, she describes how the children in the camp formed their own little society, sharing the little food they had, comforting each other, and clinging to hope, even as they witnessed the horrors unfolding around them.
It's hard to imagine finding hope in such a place.
It is.
But it speaks to the enduring strength of the human spirit, the will to survive even in the darkest of places.
Yeah, her account reminds us that even in the midst of such depravity, human connection and compassion can still exist.
Absolutely.
These individual stories, these glimpses into the lives of those who experienced Auschwitz firsthand, they add a layer of human depth to our understanding of the Holocaust.
They do.
They remind us that this wasn't just an abstract historical event. It was a tragedy that touched the lives of millions of individuals, each with their own unique story.
And their stories continue to resonate today, not just as a warning against the dangers of hatred and prejudice, but as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of remembering and honoring the victims.
Exactly. It's so crucial to keep these stories alive, to share them with future generations, to ensure that the lessons of the Holocaust are never forgotten.
Because as we've seen, the path to genocide often starts with small steps, with the dehumanization of certain groups, with the erosion of empathy and compassion.
It's a slippery slope, and we must all be vigilant in guarding against the forces that can lead us down that path.
We must.
But for now, let's turn our attention to the liberation of Auschwitz and its aftermath.
Okay, on January 27, 1945, Soviet troops entered Auschwitz, finding a scene of unimaginable devastation.
I can't imagine what those soldiers must have felt coming face to face with the horrors that had taken place there.
The Nazis had attempted to destroy much of the evidence of their crimes, burning buildings, blowing up crematoria, forcing prisoners on those horrific death marches.
But they couldn't erase everything, could they?
No. The survivors who were left behind, many of them too weak or ill to be evacuated, they bore witness to the horrors that had taken place. And their testimonies, along with the physical evidence that remained, they helped to expose the full extent of the Nazi genocide to the world.
The liberation of Auschwitz marked a turning point in history, not just in terms of the war, but in terms of our understanding of the human capacity for evil.
Absolutely. It forced the world to confront the consequences of unchecked hatred and the urgent need to prevent such atrocities from ever happening again.
But as we've discussed, the trauma of Auschwitz didn't end with liberation.
No, it didn't.
For many survivors, the physical and psychological scars of their imprisonment would linger for a lifetime.
They faced immense challenges reintegrating into society, dealing with the devastating loss of loved ones and coming to terms with the horrors they had witnessed.
And the world grappled with the enormity of the crime.
It did.
Struggling to find ways to hold the perpetrators accountable and to prevent future genocides.
The legacy of Auschwitz is complex and multifaceted. It's a story of unimaginable cruelty, but also of resilience, resistance, and the enduring power of the human spirit.
It's a stark reminder of the fragility of civilization. The dangers of unchecked power, and the urgent need for empathy, compassion, and understanding.
And it's a call to action, a reminder that we must all be vigilant in fighting against prejudice, discrimination, and the forces that can lead to hatred and violence.
So as we continue to explore the history of Auschwitz, we must do so with a sense of responsibility. Not just to remember the victims, but to learn from the past and to work towards a future where such horrors are never repeated.
Because as we delve deeper into this dark chapter of human history, we're not just uncovering the past, we're confronting our own capacity for both good and evil.
And in those reflections, we might just find a glimmer of hope, a spark of determination to create a world where such atrocities are consigned to the history books, never to be repeated. Okay, we're back for this final part of our deep dive into Auschwitz. We've traced the camp's evolution from a place of political imprisonment to just this horrific industrialized killing machine. And we've heard the stories of those who were lost and those who somehow managed to survive. Now we really have to grapple with the legacy of Auschwitz, this legacy that continues to shape our world today.
The Holocaust, with Auschwitz as its most potent symbol, stands as this stark warning
Right there.
against the dangers of unchecked hatred, prejudice, and indifference. It compels us to examine those darker sides of human nature and wrestle with the question of how could such atrocities even occur?
It's a question that has haunted humanity for decades.
It has.
How could a society, a supposedly civilized one, descend into such barbarity?
Right.
How could ordinary people become complicit in these just unimaginable acts of cruelty?
There are no easy answers.
Right.
But grappling with these questions is essential if we want to truly learn from the past and prevent future atrocities.
One of the biggest challenges, I think, in confronting the legacy of Auschwitz is the sheer scale of the horror.
Yeah.
The numbers are so staggering, the cruelty so extreme, that it can be difficult to even comprehend it.
Right.
To grasp the human cost of this genocide.
And that's where the individual stories become so important.
Right.
Hearing the voices of those who experienced Auschwitz firsthand, reading their letters and diaries, their memoirs, it helps us connect with the human dimension of this tragedy. It reminds us that behind the statistics were millions of individual lives lost, each one representing a world of its own.
It's also crucial to remember that the Holocaust didn't happen in a vacuum.
No.
It was the culmination of centuries of anti-Semitism.
Yes.
A deep-seated prejudice that had been ingrained in European culture for generations.
The Nazis didn't invent anti-Semitism.
Right.
They exploited it.
Yeah.
They used it as a tool to divide society, to scapegoat an entire group of people, and to consolidate their own power.
And tragically, anti-Semitism didn't vanish with the defeat of Nazi Germany.
It didn't.
It's still very much alive around the world.
It is.
Taking on different forms, sometimes more subtle, sometimes more overt.
Right, and that's why we have to be so vigilant in challenging anti-Semitic rhetoric and behavior, no matter how small or insignificant it might seem, because we know where such hatred can lead if it's left unchecked.
The legacy of Auschwitz also raises these really important questions about memory and memorialization.
It does.
How do we ensure that the horrors of the Holocaust are never forgotten?
Right.
How do we create memorials that are both historically accurate and emotionally resonant? And how do we make sure that these sites of memory remain relevant and meaningful for future generations?
These are questions that historians, educators, and Holocaust survivors have been grappling with for decades.
Yeah.
There's no single right answer. The most effective approach will always depend on the specific context.
But one thing's clear.
What's that?
Simply preserving the physical remnants of Auschwitz isn't enough.
No, it isn't.
We have to find ways to connect these sites of memory to the present.
Yeah.
To make them relevant to people's lives today.
And that means going beyond the statistics, beyond the historical facts, and engaging with the human stories.
Yeah.
The individual experiences of those who were imprisoned and murdered in Auschwitz.
Right.
Those stories have the power to move us in a way that facts and figures alone never could.
It also means confronting the uncomfortable truths about our own societies.
Right.
Examining the ways that prejudice and discrimination still exist, and challenging the structures that perpetuate inequality and injustice.
Because the legacy of Auschwitz isn't just about remembering the past.
Right.
It's about taking responsibility for the present and working toward a future where such horrors are never repeated.
It's a daunting task, no doubt, but one we can't shy away from.
No, we can't.
We owe it to the victims of Auschwitz, to the survivors who carry the scars of that experience, and to ourselves.
Yes.
To ensure that the lessons of the Holocaust are never forgotten and that we never allow such darkness to engulf our world again.
You know, as we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave you with a thought from Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel.
Okay.
He said, quote, "To forget a Holocaust is to kill twice.
Wow.
Let us never forget, and let us always strive to create a world where such horrors are truly consigned to the history books, never to be repeated."
Thanks for joining us for this incredibly important deep dive